What happens when the people you trust most strip you of every dime, leaving you with nothing but a barren patch of dirt and a well the whole town swears is cursed? For Victor Burlington, hitting rock bottom literally meant descending into the dark. But the shadows weren't hiding ghosts. They were hiding salvation. Victor Burlington was 44 years old when his entire reality was dismantled with surgical, merciless precision. He had spent 15 grueling years building Burlington Freight, transforming it from a single, leased rig operating out of a dusty Chicago suburb into a premier logistics empire spanning the Midwest. He was a man who believed in sweat equity, in a handshake, and most fatally, in loyalty. That loyalty was weaponized against him by Simon Gallagher. Simon wasn't just Victor's chief financial officer. He was his college roommate, his best man, the godfather to his unborn children that never came to be. For 3 years, Simon had been quietly orchestrating a corporate coup. He had established a labyrinth of shadow shell companies, funneling company debt in ways that made Victor look not just incompetent, but criminally negligent to the board of directors. When the trap finally snapped shut on a bleak Tuesday in October, Victor found himself staring at a pile of heavily doctored financial disclosures. Simon had framed him for an impending bankruptcy, and the board forced Victor out, stripping him of his equity, his severance, and his reputation, all to save the company. Simon, naturally, stepped in as the hero CEO. Victor stumbled out of the high-rise office building, his mind a static haze of disbelief. He sought refuge in the one place he thought was safe, his home. But the grand estate in the affluent suburbs was empty. His wife, Beatrice, wasn't waiting with open arms or words of comfort. She was waiting with a meticulously drafted set of divorce papers and a team of aggressive litigators. "I married a builder, Victor," Beatrice said, her voice devoid of any warmth as she stood in the foyer, her designer luggage already packed by the door. "I didn't marry a liability. My lawyers have secured a freeze on your remaining personal accounts. Don't call me." Within 48 hours, Victor went from a multi-millionaire titan of industry to a pariah living out of a duffel bag in a damp roadside motel. The betrayal was an anchor tied to his chest, dragging him into a suffocating depression. He had no money to fight Simon in court, and Beatrice had successfully weaponized their prenuptial agreement to leave him destitute. He was entirely, devastatingly alone. 3 weeks into his exile, staring blankly at a flickering motel television, Victor received a phone call from a man named Thomas Wright, an estate attorney operating out of a tiny office in rural West Virginia. "Mr. Burlington?" Wright's voice was thin and reedy. "I'm calling regarding the estate of your late uncle, Harrison Caldwell. He passed away 2 months ago, and as his sole remaining blood relative, you are the primary beneficiary of his will." Victor barely remembered Uncle Harrison. The man was the family's notorious black sheep, a paranoid eccentric who had vanished into the Appalachian Mountains in the late 1980s, severing all ties with civilization. Victor had only ever interacted with him once, sending him a polite Christmas card a decade ago, when Victor was trying to reconnect with his extended family. "Did he leave any money?" Victor asked, his voice rough from disuse. "No, sir," Wright replied bluntly. "Your uncle died penniless. However, he did leave you his property, 40 acres of undeveloped land in Copper Creek, complete with a cabin. I must warn you, Mr. Burlington, the property taxes are in arrears, and the land itself is, well, it's not considered prime real estate. The locals call it the Devil's Acre." With his motel funds dwindling to single digits and the looming threat of living on the streets of Chicago, Victor had no choice. He sold his only remaining asset, a gold watch Beatrice had neglected to claim, bought a rusted 1998 Ford Ranger, and drove east toward the sprawling, unforgiving ridges of West Virginia. The drive was a descent into a forgotten world. The crisp autumn air of the Midwest gave way to the bone-chilling, damp fog of the Appalachians. When Victor finally rolled into the town of Copper Creek, it was nothing more than a gas station, a dilapidated hardware store, and a diner that smelled of stale coffee and grease. He stopped at the diner to ask for directions to the Caldwell property. The moment he uttered his uncle's name, the ambient chatter in the room died. A waitress named Clara paused, wiping down a Formica counter, and stared at him with a mixture of pity and apprehension. An old man sitting in a corner booth, nursing a black coffee, spoke up. His name tag from a local mill read Wyatt. "You Harrison's boy?" Wyatt rasped, his eyes narrowing. "Nephew," Victor corrected, gripping the keys to his truck tightly. Wyatt shook his head, a grim, humorless smile touching his lips. "You better turn that truck around and head back to whatever city you crawled out of, son. That land is sour, and that well, it breathes. Driven 2 men, mad before your uncle ever bought the deed. Don't go near those stones. The shadows in that hollow don't play fair." Victor, hardened by the brutal reality of the corporate world, had no time for ghost stories. He thanked the old man tersely, got his directions, and drove up the winding, rutted dirt road toward his new home. The cabin was a rotting husk of timber and rusted corrugated metal, leaning precariously against a backdrop of dense, overgrown pines. But the most striking feature of the property wasn't the dilapidated house. It was the well. Situated dead center in the front yard, the well was massive. It was constructed of heavy, dark river stones, mortared tightly together. Unlike a normal wishing well, this one was completely sealed. A heavy, rusted iron grate was bolted over the opening, secured by 3 heavy-duty padlocks. Victor stood in the freezing drizzle, looking at the barren dirt, the rotting wood, and the iron-capped well. Simon was likely drinking vintage scotch in a penthouse. Beatrice was probably vacationing in Aspen. And Victor was here, in the middle of nowhere, inheriting a madman's dirt. He dropped to his knees in the mud, the sheer weight of his ruined life finally crashing down on him. And for the first time since the betrayal, he wept. The first month at Copper Creek was a brutal exercise in primal survival. Victor's soft, executive hands blistered and bled as he spent his days chopping dead wood to feed the cabin's inefficient cast-iron stove. His diet consisted of canned beans, stale bread, and whatever cheap provisions he could secure from the town hardware store on a rapidly maxing out credit card. The physical exhaustion was agonizing, but it was the nights that nearly broke his sanity. The cabin offered no insulation from the biting November winds, but the cold wasn't the worst part. It was the noise. Old Man Wyatt hadn't been lying. The well breathed. It started around midnight. A low, rhythmic resonance would vibrate through the frozen ground, penetrating the floorboards of the cabin. It sounded like a massive mechanical exhalation, a deep, hollow whoosh, followed by a sharp, whistling intake of air. Sometimes it was faint, but on other nights it sounded like a choir of suppressed, guttural whispers echoing up from the bowels of the earth. Local law claimed the well was dug on top of a collapsed pioneer graveyard, or that it was the site of a tragic mining accident that left dozens of men trapped in the dark. The townsfolk swore the sounds were the ghosts of the trapped, begging for air. Uncle Harrison, according to the town gossip, had spent his final years sitting on the porch with a loaded shotgun, screaming at the stones to quiet down. Victor, however, was a man of logic. Ghosts didn't steal companies. Men did. Spirits didn't draft divorce papers. Greedy spouses did. He refused to be intimidated by a hole in the ground. Desperation forced his hand. The cabin's indoor plumbing had been destroyed by burst pipes years ago, and Victor was tired of driving 3 miles to a public creek to haul water. He needed the well. On a grey, freezing morning, Victor took a heavy sledgehammer and a pair of bolt cutters from his truck. He approached the dark stone structure. The heavy iron grate was thick, but the padlocks were rusted through from decades of harsh mountain winters. With a few heavy, jarring swings of the sledgehammer, the locks shattered. Victor heaved the heavy iron grate off the opening. It hit the dirt with a massive thud. He leaned over the edge and peered into the abyss. The smell hit him first, and it made him frown. A forgotten, stagnant water well should smell of sulfur, algae, and rotting earth. This well smelled of ozone, dry dust, and machine oil. He picked up a large stone from the yard and dropped it into the darkness, waiting for the familiar splash. 1, 2, 3. Clang! The sound was sharp, metallic, and echoed violently up the stone shaft. It wasn't water. The stone had hit solid iron. Victor's brow furrowed. He rushed to his truck and grabbed his heavy-duty Maglite flashlight. Shining the powerful beam down the shaft, the light pierced the gloom. About 40 feet down, the well didn't end in a pool of dark water. It ended in a flat, riveted steel floor. The mystery deepened that evening, when Victor began tearing up the rotting floorboards of the cabin to use as kindling. Hidden beneath the floor of the bedroom, wrapped tightly in thick layers of oilcloth, he found a series of leather-bound journals. They belonged to Uncle Harrison. Victor opened the first book, the pages brittle and yellowed. He expected the ramblings of a lunatic, but instead he found meticulous, highly technical blueprints. Pages were filled with complex architectural drawings of ventilation shafts, moisture control variables, and load-bearing concrete stress tests. Harrison hadn't gone mad. He had been building something, or rather, hiding something. Victor read through the night by the light of a kerosene lamp. Harrison's entries painted a picture of a brilliant, deeply paranoid engineer. October 14th, 1993. The moisture seal is holding. The secondary pumps are functioning at optimal capacity. The town thinks I'm crazy. They think the well is haunted. Let them. Madness is the best camouflage. The draft must flow to keep the lower chamber dry. The legacy must be preserved at all costs. April 2nd, 2001. My health is failing. I cannot maintain the primary generator much longer. The fortune requires vigilance. If the dampness breaches the vault, it will all be ruined. I have updated my will. The lawyers think I have nothing. Let them think it. I will leave it to the only one who ever showed me an ounce of grace. Victor. He sent a card, a small gesture, but a telling one. He will need it one day. Victor's heart pounded against his ribs. The fortune, the vault. He closed the journal. The whispers from the well outside suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't a haunting. It was an active subterranean mechanical ventilation system designed to cycle air and prevent moisture buildup in an underground chamber. The well was nothing but a disguised air shaft. The next morning, a severe Appalachian gale rolled over the valley. The wind howled, snapping branches and tearing shingles from the cabin roof. Victor didn't care about the storm. He was consumed by the revelation. He drove his truck right up to the edge of the well. He rigged a heavy winch line from the front bumper, securing a makeshift harness around his waist, using heavy tow straps and climbing rope he had purchased from the hardware store. Rain lashed at his face as he clipped a carabiner to his chest. He backed over the edge of the stone lip, the winch motor whining loudly as he slowly lowered himself into the dark. The descent was terrifying. The stone walls of the well were slick with rain at the top, but as he dropped past the 20-foot mark, the environment changed drastically. The mortared stone abruptly stopped, transitioning into smooth, modern, industrial steel casing. The air grew remarkably dry and warm. At 40 feet down, Victor's boots hit the solid steel floor. He unclipped his harness and shone his flashlight around. The floor was actually a massive maritime-style bulkhead door, complete with a heavy, multi-pronged locking wheel in the center. Victor dropped to his knees, gripping the cold steel of the wheel. He strained with all his remaining strength, his muscles burning from weeks of manual labor. With a screech of protesting metal, the wheel turned. He spun it until the locking mechanisms clicked open, and he heaved the heavy hatch upward. A rush of stale, perfectly climate-controlled air blasted him in the face. Victor shone his flashlight down into the newly opened hole. A solid steel ladder descended another 20 feet into a vast, concrete-lined bunker. He climbed down, his breath hitching in his throat. When his boots touched the bottom, he found a rusted breaker box on the wall. Praying that Harrison's primary generator still had a drop of fuel, he threw the heavy switch. Deep within the earth, a diesel engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. Fluorescent lights flickered, buzzing loudly before flooding the massive underground cavern with harsh, white light. Victor stumbled backward, his back hitting the cold concrete wall as he took in the sheer scale of what lay before him. The people who had betrayed him, Simon, Beatrice, the board, had stripped him of millions. But what Uncle Harrison had been hiding at the bottom of the cursed well was worth so much more. The fluorescent lights hummed a harsh, industrial tune, banishing decades of absolute darkness. Victor stood frozen at the base of the ladder, his flashlight completely unnecessary as the vast subterranean chamber revealed itself. The bunker was roughly the size of a commercial airplane hangar, its walls lined with reinforced, load-bearing concrete. Industrial-grade dehumidifiers, powered by the massive diesel generator he had just engaged, lined the perimeter. The air was impeccably dry, smelling faintly of old canvas and machine grease. Uncle Harrison hadn't just built a hole. He had engineered a localized microclimate designed for absolute indefinite preservation. But it was the center of the room that stole the breath from Victor's lungs. Arranged in perfect diagonal symmetry were 5 massive silhouettes, each draped in heavy, custom-fitted, breathable canvas dust covers. To the right of the vehicles sat a row of heavy olive-drab military surplus crates, stacked head-high against the concrete. Victor's legs felt like lead as he walked toward the first draped silhouette. He grabbed the hem of the canvas and pulled it back. The heavy fabric slid off, pooling on the floor. Beneath it sat a pristine, flawlessly preserved 1937 Mercedes-Benz 5.4 OK Special Roadster. Its silver paint caught the harsh fluorescent light, gleaming as if it had rolled off the assembly line that very morning. The leather interior was immaculate. The chrome trim was completely untarnished. Victor was no classic car aficionado, but as a logistics executive, he knew asset value. Even a casual observer knew a vehicle like this was a museum piece. Feverishly, Victor moved down the line, tearing the covers away. The reveals grew increasingly staggering. A 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, painted in iconic Rosso Corsa red. A 1938 Bugatti Type 57 C Atalante, its sweeping aerodynamic lines perfectly intact. A 1955 Porsche 550 Spider, the exact model James Dean had famously driven. A 1929 Duesenberg Model J, a titan of American automotive engineering. Harrison hadn't just been collecting cars. He had been hoarding the rarest, most highly sought-after automotive artifacts on the planet. He had likely purchased them in the late 1970s and 80s, long before the classic car market exploded into the stratosphere, and buried them away from the eyes of a society he deeply distrusted. Trembling, Victor turned his attention to the olive-drab crates. He used an old crowbar resting nearby to pry the lid off the first box. It was packed with tightly bound stacks of crisp, vintage $100 bills, completely untouched by moisture or rot. The second crate was infinitely heavier. When Victor broke the seal, a dull, golden luster reflected his awestruck face. It was packed to the brim with pre-1933 American gold double eagles and South African Krugerrands. He found a final leather-bound journal resting on top of a steel desk in the corner. Victor opened it to the last entry, dated merely a year before Harrison's death. The world is fragile. Banks fail, markets crash, and men in suits steal what honest men build. They called me paranoid when I liquidated my engineering firm in '89. Let them. Hard assets do not lie. Gold does not default. Masterpieces of steel and oil do not declare bankruptcy. To Victor, you sent a card to a crazy old man when you gained nothing by doing so. If you are reading this, you are standing in my legacy. Do not let the vultures take it. Use it. Burn them to the ground. Victor closed the journal. The tears he had shed yesterday in the mud were the last he would ever shed for his old life. He was no longer a ruined man living out of a duffel bag. He was the sole proprietor of a fortune that easily eclipsed the company he had lost. But unearthing the treasure was only the first step. To weaponize it, he needed allies. He drove into Copper Creek, using his last $200 to buy a prepaid burner phone. Sitting in the cab of his rusted Ford Ranger, he dialed a number he hadn't called in 4 years. It belonged to David Kensington, a ruthless, semi-retired forensic accountant and corporate attorney based in London. David had famously clashed with Simon Gallagher years ago, calling Simon a charlatan in a tailored suit, before Simon successfully pushed him out of Burlington Freight's advisory board. "Kensington," the crisp British voice answered. "David, it's Victor Burlington." A pause on the line. "Victor, I read about the board's decision. Simon Gallagher is a cancer. I'm sorry it took your livelihood for the board to discover it. I need your help, David. Off the books." Victor gripped the steering wheel. "I need discreet appraisers, a specialized extraction crew, and airtight offshore holding companies set up immediately. No one in Chicago can know." "Extraction of what, exactly?" David asked. His curiosity piqued. Victor looked back toward the mountain. "I have roughly $150 million in undocumented, untraceable hard assets buried under a mountain in West Virginia, and I want to use it to buy back my life." There was a long silence on the other end, followed by the sound of a heavy sigh. "I'll have a private jet on standby in 2 hours, Victor. Send me the coordinates." The extraction took 3 painstakingly slow, nerve-wracking months, operating under the guise of an environmental soil remediation project. David Kensington's hand-picked, heavily vetted European crew descended on the Copper Creek property. They erected a massive, windowless, temporary warehouse over the well, sealing it off from the prying eyes of the locals. In the dead of winter, using specialized industrial winches and a widened shaft, the priceless vehicles were brought to the surface. They were loaded into climate-controlled, unmarked transport rigs and driven directly to a private airstrip, bound for elite, silent auction houses in Geneva and Monaco. The gold and cash were quietly integrated into a complex web of Swiss trust funds and holding companies under the name Deep Earth Holdings, LLC. The total liquid value of Uncle Harrison's paranoia yielded a staggering $187 million. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Simon Gallagher's reign as CEO was rapidly imploding. Without Victor's meticulous operational oversight, Burlington Freight was bleeding capital. Simon was a brilliant manipulator, but a terrible logistician. To cover the massive quarterly losses, Simon began taking on toxic, high-interest commercial debt, desperate to keep the stock price afloat long enough to cash out his options. Victor watched it all happen from a luxury penthouse in London, biding his time like a spider in a web. When Burlington Freight's debt reached critical mass, Victor struck. Using Deep Earth Holdings, Victor aggressively and anonymously bought up every single piece of Burlington Freight's commercial paper from the nervous banks. Within weeks, Victor owned 80% of his former company's debt. The trap was set. On a rainy Tuesday in April, exactly 1 year after Victor had been ousted, Simon Gallagher called an emergency shareholder meeting in the very same high-rise boardroom where he had staged his coup. The company was in default. Simon, sweating through his custom Italian suit, stood at the head of the mahogany table, trying to placate the furious board members. "We are currently in negotiations with our primary creditor, Deep Earth Holdings," Simon stammered, wiping his brow. "They have agreed to a debt-for-equity swap. It will dilute our shares, yes, but it will save the company from Chapter 11. The representative for Deep Earth is here today to finalize the transition." The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. The room fell dead silent. Victor Burlington walked in. He wasn't the broken, exhausted man they had thrown to the wolves 12 months ago. He wore a bespoke Savile Row suit, a platinum Patek Philippe on his wrist, and an expression of utter, chilling calm. David Kensington walked a half-step behind him, carrying a single leather briefcase. Simon's face drained of all color. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "Victor? What are you doing here? Security!" "Security works for the majority shareholder, Simon," Victor said, his voice smooth and commanding. He tossed a thick binder onto the table. "And as of this morning, Deep Earth Holdings owns 64% of Burlington Freight's voting stock. You don't work for the board anymore, Simon. You work for me." The board members, realizing the gravity of the shift, remained completely silent. "Furthermore," David Kensington chimed in, stepping forward, "during the due diligence phase of our debt acquisition, my forensic accounting team uncovered the shadow shell companies used to artificially inflate the debt that led to Mr. Burlington's original ousting. We have already submitted these findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the Department of Justice." Simon collapsed into his leather chair, the realization of his total destruction washing over him. The corporate coup was over. He was going to federal prison. The news of Victor's miraculous return and sudden billionaire status sent shockwaves through Chicago's elite. It took less than 48 hours for Beatrice to resurface. She cornered Victor outside of his newly repurchased downtown estate, looking frantic, clutching a folder of legal documents. "Victor!" she cried out, attempting to manufacture a look of profound relief. "I knew it! I knew Simon set you up! I never wanted to leave, but my lawyers—" "Save it, Beatrice," Victor interrupted, not breaking his stride as he walked toward the front door. "You can't just brush me off." Her voice turned shrill, the facade dropping instantly. "We were married when you inherited that land in West Virginia. Half of that wealth is marital property. I've already filed a motion to void the divorce decree based on hidden assets." Victor finally stopped and turned around. He looked at the woman who had abandoned him at his lowest point, feeling nothing but profound pity. "You should fire your lawyers, Beatrice," Victor said quietly. "Uncle Harrison died on August 14th. You forced me to sign the expedited divorce papers and aggressively enforced our prenuptial agreement that left me with nothing on September 2nd. My uncle's will wasn't probated, and I wasn't notified of the inheritance until September 23rd. He stepped closer, his eyes cold and unyielding. I didn't hide assets from you, Beatrice. You were just so eager to throw me away when you thought I was broke that you legally severed yourself from me 3 weeks before I became a billionaire. By your own demand, what's mine is mine. Beatrice stood frozen on the sidewalk, her jaw trembling as the catastrophic magnitude of her greed finally caught up with her. She had engineered her own poverty. Victor turned his back on her and walked into his home, the heavy oak doors closing with a definitive, satisfying click. A month later, Victor returned to Copper Creek. He didn't come in a rusted Ford Ranger, but in a sleek, black SUV. The town was exactly as he had left it, quiet, foggy, and forgotten by time. He drove up the winding dirt road to the Caldwell property. The temporary warehouse was gone, the heavy equipment cleared away. The cabin still leaned precariously, and the massive stone well sat silently in the center of the yard. Victor walked up to the edge of the well. He had paid a local contractor handsomely to pour 4 feet of solid reinforced concrete down the shaft, sealing the bunker forever. He stood in the cool Appalachian breeze, looking down at the unmovable stones. He had lost his company to a traitor, lost his wife to greed, and lost his sanity to a cold motel room. But in the depths of the Devil's Acre, beneath the whispers of a haunted well, he had found his salvation. Victor patted the cold stone of the well once, whispered a quiet, "Thank you, Uncle Harrison," and drove back to the Empire he had reclaimed, leaving the shadows of Copper Creek behind him for good. Victor's journey from a betrayed, penniless outcast to a vindicated billionaire proves that sometimes the darkest holes hold our brightest futures. While Simon faces federal prison and Beatrice lives with the crushing weight of her own greed, Victor reclaimed his empire using a madman's hidden genius. If this incredible true story of ultimate revenge and buried treasure kept you hooked, hit that like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe for more thrilling tales of fortune.